All right. Welcome to the Death and All the Rest podcast, where we talk about life, death, and everything in between. Chris, I was thinking existential dread, as we've talked about, is obviously like an ever-present theme in my life. And this has come up for me in my own personal work a lot lately. And I've been reflecting on the ways that I manage my own existential dread when it happens. Because this is part of what we're trying to bring to this podcast is have people understand skills and strategies in managing it. There's part of us where we're just talking about different things that relate to how we're looking at life and why we're here and the meaning of it all. But also we want people to feel like there's something to take away from this, that they're gaining something, learning something from us. And I've been thinking a lot about how do you manage existential dread. We talked about in the last episode, it can be something that we're avoiding, which isn't always helpful because then we can get to the end of our lives or a certain point in our life where we're like, shit, I didn't think about this at all, and now I'm filled with regret and despair. Right. Thinking about it too much can be paralyzing and debilitating. So trying to strike balance in that, I think we're pretty self-aware that we are more consumed by it than the midline population and how it thinks about existential dread. But not so consumed that we can't function, right? We're both really functional people, but I thought it'd be useful for us to chat with each other and just hear what we both do, and also to share some tips and tricks about what that looks like, what kind of strategies we do find useful for ourselves in navigating this.
Sounds good. Are you asking me what the things that I do?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. What do you do? What are the nuanced things too, right? Not just like totally self-care. I want to hear all about the self-care and the specifics that you do. Because I mentioned in the last episode, like, I know you have really specific parameters around like tech use and things like that. That's something, but, and then the nuanced things, like, what do you do when your head is getting caught up and you're overthinking and you're caught in the spiral of it all? Like, just what's useful.
Well, yeah, the basics of self-care that I do is I've tried to make my practice automatic, almost unconscious. And a big thing for me to not have a day where I feel overwhelmed is to start out strong. And to do that, hopefully I got a good night's sleep. But I get up in the morning and I have ritualized my morning routine, which is making my breakfast, having my cup of coffee. I go online while I'm eating my eggs and my banana or whatever. And it's always the same, not like rigid, but it's like almost like a little game I play with myself, my little routine. So I get good food, I get my coffee, so I'm caffeinated, I'm hydrated, I'll watch a little bit of the news, so I get a little pissed off, and the little charge, and then I go work out.
Start your day.
Just a little bit, not too much. That's key, because I don't want my first moment or my first conscious activity in the day to be doom scrolling. I want it to be positive. And then I go work out, hour and a half working out. And that way, after that's done, and I get up, I'm an early riser. So I'm usually done by around 7, 8. So
done working out by 7 or 8? Like, you've done all of this
everything's
before
done.
7 or 8 a.m.? What?
Well, I usually get up anywhere from 5 to 6. And then, that's probably something I should talk about. I have the luck, after having a lifetime of having a very strict schedule, that I'd be able to craft my schedule a lot more than maybe a lot of other people. So my workday, I don't have it start usually typically until around 11. So I don't set an alarm. I just wake up when I'm conscious. And I think that's huge. I probably should have led with that. So I wake up whenever, and I get out of bed. I do my morning ritual. And
what time are you going to bed to get yourself to where like you're naturally waking up that time in the morning?
At 9 o'clock, we turn off tech and we listen to a record, analog music, vinyl. Usually just one side of a record at 9, or we just go straight to bed if we're really tired. And we spend an hour between 9 and 10 talking or reading or listening to music. And then we pass out around 10 in general. Okay. That's not hard and fast, but that's the goal. And we're pretty good at hitting it most of the time. So usually, I'm going to bed at 10 and getting up at between 5 and 6. So I get my 7 or 8, And whenever I'm up and I finish my morning routine, and I have such a long lifetime of depression and anger and bitterness and just a heavy, bad emotional weight in my life.
Mm-hmm.
That starting out really, really strong and positive is a huge win for me because I front load a good day.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time I'm done with all these things, it's 8 a.m., say 8:39. I can always lean on that and say, all right, did the self-care. I had a strong start of the morning. I ate well. No matter what happens, I'm already ahead. The exercise is done. I'm
Mm-hmm.
already ahead, so I can go into work, and that helps me a lot. So I'm not carrying too much negativity from the previous day. I'm not worried too much about anything. I usually go to bed like looking forward to the next day, to the next morning, because I enjoyed that time so much. And I didn't spend my entire life that way. 40
Yeah.
years, I was always more like, I can't wait to be unconscious. Now I'm like, I can't wait for my morning because that's when I feel the best.
Yeah, you're like
So
giving yourself as
I've
clean a slate as you can give yourself in the morning, it sounds like, too, right? Like good sleep, you're getting the workouts, you're clearing the mind, getting your body moving, sitting down, having like a nice slow start to the morning. Like this is what you talked about spoon theory in the last episode. And like you're doing everything that you can to make sure that you're starting out with as much volume out of your spoons as you can.
Yep, and it works really, really well. Uh, and then I go into my day, and it's up and down, and the biggest threat for me is the exposure to the internet and social media. Unfortunately, because of the work we do, I'm always exposed to tech. If I wasn't, I would have no tech in my life. I'm pretty sure I could get by on very minimal tech. And on my computer, since you mentioned it, I have programs that block me out of a vast majority of social media.
Mm.
They're basically programs that there's two kinds. There's the ones that parental control programs. I tried those, and now people have started to make programs so that you can lock yourself out. You can like brick your computer and your phone now. There's even a product called Brick. And I've kind of done that. And I've tweaked it to keep me away from the nasty little corners that I'm most likely to fall into and that will fill me with despair, frankly, and
Do
the
you
not
have
wanting to be here.
Yeah. Do
Hmm?
you have certain programs that are blocked constantly, or do your blocks come in at like a certain time after a certain amount of hours? Like, how do you have your blocks set up?
There's about 30 programs that I'm locked out of all the time. I do have it so that there's no internet after roughly 6, 7 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
until midnight. And I really only do that because it makes sure I turn it off a little bit earlier. And it's not like I'm going to get up after midnight and turn on the tech. So that carries over to the next day. So I
Mm-hmm.
have a few different social media areas that are blocked off and news sites that are blocked off. And on my phone, I have all the apps and all that stuff, the screen time put on there, and then a passcode put on that. And then I forgot the passcode. So it just basically made my iPhone kind of a dumb phone, which is interesting. And it's worked fairly well. This is never going to be enough for me because I'm always like the craving is there to look for this stuff
Mm-hmm.
and find this stuff. So it's just a constant battle. But these little outside external controls have helped a lot to just limit the exposure.
Yeah.
And that helps me a lot. Those are the major things I do. When I find myself caught up and spiraling and getting escalated about existence and in general despair, usually what I will do is I will either go outside and go for a walk. I will change my environment and engage in some kind of activity that puts me in a different mental space.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, or I will recognize what I'm doing with it and like actually try and not and sit with it instead of poking the bear and continuing to look at the news or whatever. I'll stop doing that and I'll sit with the feeling and wait for it to pass.
Mm-hmm.
And not run from it. You'll have language that's more clinical for like what I'm doing, but this is something that I read somewhere at some time about from CBT or DBT, and uh, you recognize it and sit with it, and instead of letting it overwhelm you, you allow it to flow through you and then flow out of you and pass, and that actually makes you feel powerful because you know that it ends and you know that you don't have to run from it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I do something similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's a really similar thing. Is that there are times, and this is something that I've learned and been implementing recently in the last several months. This has been something I've really been leaning into because for me, for the longest time, these thoughts would happen and I would default to countering the thought, right? Like trying to challenge that thought, countering a cognitive distortion that I'm having about the thought. Sometimes there's not, um, it's not a cognitive distortion to be afraid of dying. Like we're going to die, right? That's not so.
Yeah.
When I get cognitive distortion, can be around thinking that I think I know what happens when I die. That I think I'm going to just cease to exist and be oblivious for the rest of eternity. That's a cognitive distortion that I can do some challenging with and say that I don't know. And it's not so black and white and nobody knows that. But if I'm just getting caught up in the thought of dying in and of itself, that's not a cognitive distortion. It's not flawed logic. And what do you do with that? And I do what's called sitting with your shadows, right? Because like the shadows, the darker parts of you that we often want to run from or avoid or try to soothe in some way and meet that with soothing language by countering that belief or challenging that belief. And it's not always useful. Sometimes it's useful and sometimes it's useful to just sit with that shadow. And there's this cool outcome that can happen with that too. And maybe you've had a similar thing and maybe this is where we differ in that, but like sitting with the shadows for me is really engaging that fear, that anxiety, whichever it is that's unlocked. And I think I mentioned this before in our first episode, like the difference between how our brain, what happens with anxiety and fear and emotions in general, like the amygdala versus the cortex. Sometimes we can feel fear and just all like raw basic emotions from our amygdala because there's a stimulus. We have that response, that automatic response. A lot of times it's actually our cortex sending the message to our amygdala because it's thinking. The cognition part of it is having thoughts that are making us feel a certain way, and then it's sending that message to our amygdala, making our amygdala upset, and then creating those emotions as a result. So in the situations where it's that, addressing the thoughts is really important, and addressing the thoughts by countering them or by sitting with them. But there's an exposure that happens to have to actually sit with your fear. For me, I even sometimes play out like what my fear is. Okay, I'm worried that I'll die, and let's play out a scenario where I die. Nobody's here to do anything to save me. I'm actively like imagining what it's like to be dying and then to be dead, and then the worst case scenario for me, right? I cease to exist. And getting there is anxiety provoking as hell. I get sick to my stomach. I feel like I'm going to throw up. But at the end of that, even in that worst case scenario for myself, ceasing to exist, that's it. It's over, right? It's over. I never have to worry about this again. And depending on what actually happens, I don't know. There's lots of different variables. I've played this out so many different ways, but you get through it, and then there is exactly what you're talking about, that empowering feeling, that feeling of success over something. I have no control over dying, but I do have control over how much it takes the wheel and steers my fear. And I've taken that back a little bit, and I've done this tiny exposure that we can do. This is a mental exercise for exposure, and it helps a lot.
Yeah. I mean, really, what we're talking about here is, like you said, logical thinking, like using better mental models to navigate our thoughts and our feelings and our distress. You know,
Yeah.
some of what you said, like really intense feelings, I get that. Not like I'm afraid of death, but anger and frustration about existence. But also, what I get, so much of my life has been around this, and I didn't know this, is emptiness and dissociation and a general like loss of life in the sense of like lost consciousness. And that distresses me. My internal experience is very choppy. I'm doing this, now I'm doing this, now I'm doing this. It's very intermittent. I don't have a strong narrative line through my life. And it feels like a badly edited movie, which is something I've said a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that. There's the fact that I don't remember most of my childhood. so much of it is lost. There is the fact that I drank like a fish for 20 years, and there was a lot of brownouts and blackouts in that.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got sober and I talked to, I had a neuropsych test and I talked to my doctor and I told him all that, he was like, whoa. He's like, that's brain damage, Chris,
Wow.
So I've lost a lot of my life. I've woken
Yeah.
up in jail. I was walking home one day, and then the next thing I knew, I was waking up in county underneath a toilet. I wasn't good.
So
I'd
when
get
you
there.
say loss of consciousness, because you said like that's something that'll get to you, the loss of consciousness, you're talking about life lived and consciousness that you haven't had, not like
Yeah.
where I talk about like consciousness if we cease to exist, but you're talking about like these moments that have already happened where you haven't had consciousness.
Yeah. Well, I was out there doing things,
Yeah.
and maybe I wasn't fully present. Maybe I couldn't construct memories at that time. That's alcohol, right? Um, Maybe I was just not strongly conscious. Sometimes I'll be standing at the kitchen sink. It seems to happen there, and I'll look outside, and everything will gray out, like it'll all blur out, and I'll just like lose myself and like fade out of like consciousness and like snap out of it, like what the fuck just happened? And I've talked to people about this, and I've had other people say, "Oh yeah, I've experienced that." So I know it's not just me, but I have this internal experience where it's choppy. I know I've lost consciousness a lot in the course of my life. The alcohol, the lost, very poorly remembered childhood, and that is my existence.
Mm-hmm.
And I dread that. And you don't ever notice it because the act itself is the loss of the ability to notice.
Yeah.
And if I think forward in my life, I come from a family with a lot of senility and dementia on both sides.
Mm.
Now, some of those, dementia is a big catch-all word, much more than just Alzheimer's, and some of that has some genetic potential, and a lot of it doesn't. So it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean that I'm fated for that, but I have a
Yeah.
fear of it. You know,
Yeah.
I'm more afraid of being here and losing myself, and still being alive. Who knows what's happening to me? Than I am of being dead.
Mm. You said something similar to that in the last episode too, and it had me thinking because yes, like the idea of physically being here but mentally not being here with dementia or any version of that, that's so sad. It's like it's devastating to think about that. There's also on the flip side of that, and the thing that gets to me more when we're talking about like actually being alive and like potential scary outcomes that can happen is being fully mentally there but physically declined to a point where you can't do anything to take care of yourself, maybe not even feeding yourself, right? And you're just waiting for this moment where something's going to get you, whether it's like you trip and fall if you still have any kind of mobility, or you choke on something, your lungs give out because they're just not working. Like that, being conscious of that, being aware of that, that scares me more. I say this, and this sounds like I'm minimizing the experience of dementia, and I'm not, because I think that sounds tragic, and I don't want either of these outcomes for myself personally if
Sure.
I have a choice in it. But like, man, it scares me more to know what's happening and be watching it and waiting. That just sounds like a fate worse than any hell that I could
Yeah.
imagine.
Like existence, but no agency.
No
So
agency, no anything, like not even being able to fix your own pillow to make it more comfortable, you
yeah,
know?
yeah. And there's a lot of different forms that can take. There's that trapped in body disease that you can get, where
Mm-hmm.
you're locked in, and you can like maybe
Mm-hmm.
move your eyes. There's
Yeah.
there's a disease that where your body becomes more rigid over time, and it creeps and it
Mm-hmm.
just gets more and more rigid. There's
Mm-hmm.
paralysis, the
Yep.
various forms of paralysis. there is people the last guy just died. People from a version of polio where they had to be in an iron lung his entire life.
Oh,
Yeah.
recently that happened?
Well, there was a bunch of these people in iron lungs who had gotten polio, but they have all
Mm-hmm.
slowly died off over the years.
Yeah.
And the
Mm-hmm.
last guy just passed within the last couple of years. And to come to challenge what I just said, he seemed to be really full of life. I mean, he couldn't
Mm.
get out. He
Yeah.
was just had to lay down with just his head out of this thing for decades. And he was a grandfather, and he had a fair level of success. And he
Wow.
was apparently a very positive guy. Um, so what does that mean? I've read a couple of books by people who had the trapped in their body, whatever the
Mm.
proper term for that is, and
Mm-hmm.
just the ability to write a book while in that state is pretty impressive. So I don't
It's
know.
yeah, that feels so much like we were talking about in our last episode too, of like the middle ground of being positive without being like the toxic positivity of everything is great, when it's like not everything is great by any means, but also not getting so bogged down by the negative and the bad things that are happening in our circumstances. It's radical acceptance, right? Like in
Mm-hmm.
certain scenarios, this is just what it's going to be, and we can decide to let that be the thing that is a barrier for us in ever achieving any kind of happiness or peace again. Or we can say, okay, we accept our circumstances. We can acknowledge that that still sucks, but like I want to at least get some kind of, like, when you say this guy was successful and seemed to have like a really full life. I mean, that's incredible. That's incredible for someone who's living their life in this iron lung, but finding a way to still find value and meaning and happiness and all those things in life. Like, you know, that's a good reminder of trying to strike that balance and figuring out how to hold that and how to still validate our realities when they're happening,
Sure.
and acknowledge that this thing is happening to us and that sucks. Then also still find ways to not let that could really hinder what we get out of life by the end of it. And if you're living for 30 years like that, 50 years like that, what, you lose all that life because you just can't accept the circumstances, that, and then that feels like by the time you get to the end of it, there's going to be a lot of despair about that.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're trapped, all you have is your thoughts.
Yeah.
Do you want to make your thoughts horrible, or do you want to make your thoughts positive? That's your agency right there, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Who's written very, very well about this for years now is Michael J. Fox.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read his books, Lucky Man, and the rest of his memoirs. Man,
I haven't.
you should. I think I read a lot of memoir, and he's just a very, very good writer. He's made himself a very good writer, and he puts it all out there. How, like, the height of his career, A-list actor when this very young when this started to happen, and now he's lived 2, 3, 4 times longer than most people with the diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just I think he was given an award by President Biden, and he's I would say probably getting near the end of his life and struggling,
Mm-hmm.
and he does a really good job of saying, yeah, I'm being really positive, and he's raised tons of money to fight Parkinson's. I think he
Mm-hmm.
has raised more money than anybody else, his foundation, but he's like,
Yeah.
yeah, this still sucks though. he's he's been
Yeah.
very honest and clear about it.
And that's so real, because that does suck, right? And
Yeah.
it sucks that you just have this degenerative disease that you have no control over, you have no say over. There's nothing you can do to stop it. There are things, that you can do to hopefully like slow it down sometimes in some ways. I know like stress management can be something to help, but like it's still gonna happen. And I think it's fair to even have moments where you just sit and stew in your anger about that, and the
Yeah.
injustice of it all, the unfairness of it. That's human. There's nothing wrong with being human. with having our emotions and
Yeah.
allowing them to be what they are. It just, how do we keep ourselves from getting stuck? I think this is another really useful strategy that we both probably use and that other people would benefit from knowing about, like the difference between, we don't want to avoid those emotions because then we're just pretending that doesn't happen. And then a lot of times that's bottling it up. And then eventually they just explode all over us or
Right.
all over someone else in some capacity. And we don't
Yeah.
want to get stuck in it. And how do you kind of said something about this when you were first speaking about when you have those spiraling thoughts, and you said, I just sit with those emotions and let them be. But like, for some people hearing that, I bet they're like, what does that look like? Like, what do you do? How do you sit with an emotion? And then how do you move away from it healthily?
I literally stop doing whatever else I'm doing and I sit down on the couch and I feel like crap. And I sit there and I watch the thought, I watch the feeling like in my mind and in my body and just breathe and I
Mm-hmm.
wait it out and let it pass because I'm just not going to stay there. It will fade. Um, and for me, that helps de-escalate.
Mm-hmm.
It's when I try to fight the feeling or I like try to wish it away or challenge it. That sometimes those work, but a lot of times it doesn't for
Mm-hmm.
me. Now, not all the time. Sometimes I can go out and do something else. I can exercise. I can go for a walk. I can do push-ups. But sometimes I can't, or sometimes it just I don't want to.
Yeah.
This just seems like the course of action at that moment. Um, and it does pass that way. And when I say it felt powering, I said that empowering earlier. It's not like yeah, just kick that feeling's ass. It's just that ability to watch the whole life cycle of the feeling
Mm-hmm.
feels very useful and powerful because you're able to distance itself from you. This is not who I am. This is something I feel that I'm subject to. I am not my thoughts. I am not my feelings. I'm still Chris. I felt like shit and it's past. I'm back to being Chris. I'm good. And that helps a lot. Another thing that is associated with it, I think, is trying to be humble. I think have been in my life a very cocky, arrogant, and also insecure and bitter
Mm-hmm.
an angry individual. And I think a lot of those feelings like the world is on my shoulders, everybody's out to get me, um, all that stuff is vanity. It feels like it is grandiose thinking.
Mm.
And I'm making the problem bigger than it should be, than it is. And I bring myself back to the ground and say, dude, you just one little human life. Chill the fuck out. Sit with
Mm-hmm.
it. It'll pass, and I can go back to my life. Um, Practicing being humble and practicing grace with myself. They're all wrapped up in these things.
Yeah.
And I don't think my practice is like a checklist of like, I tried A, B, C, D. If A doesn't work, go to B. Da, 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 da. It's just all these things that I have that I've done enough, that I've made automatic enough that they just kind of crop up in my life organically as I move through my day, um, and move through my life, and it works. And my baseline, because of all this stuff, is much better than it was for 20 some odd years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my homeostasis, the intensity of my despair and anger, it has decreased dramatically because of all this.
How do you feel like practice plays into all of this? Like, I imagine you have all these skills and all these strategies, and like you said, at this point they're habit, and you can flick through the Rolodex without even thinking about it. It's not that, oh, I tried this and A didn't work, now it's going to B and then C and then D and so on until you run through it. Like, you just kind of know default, like, I'm going to try this, I do this, like these are things that work, and you know what to access and what scenario to try and then what to go to next. But like, what about, how does practice weigh into that? I imagine you have decades of practice in that,
I mean,
in
practice is
building those
everything.
habits. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I look at them as practice. They look at them
Yeah.
as like a discipline, something that you can never master. It's not like people talk about, um, I need to figure this out, or I need to figure out my mind out, or like I learned to love myself, and as if like you turned that page and you never have to worry about that again. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like you fixed yourself, and that's just not been in my personal experience. Instead, if I look at the self-care and I look at these kinds of things as stuff I'm going to continue to practice, that I'm always cycling back into, that I'm always getting knocked off of and trying to return to center. So I think about it like that. And since I've rejected perfection, because I'm never going to get perfect at it, but I can always practice it, um, they just keep coming up in my life. And
Mm-hmm.
I just keep returning to this stuff. And I spent a lot of time on this. And I think that because of that, um, even though I have this brain where I have a very poor memory, and especially my working memory, and I get lost in my own head all the time, I've just done it so much that it's automatic. It's probably in my
Mm-hmm.
subconscious, and it's messy, but it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah. It's, and something too, like for me at least, I'll just speak to my own experience with practice, because I've also had decades, 2.5 decades probably, of practicing this, from the time I was really aware that my anxiety was out of control, and that it takes a lot of learning. But a lot of it too is like learning that sometimes something that you have heard about or you've tried in the past that didn't work doesn't mean it won't ever be helpful. Like I've
Mhm.
learned to like cycle through new things, deep breathing wasn't something that earlier on was super useful, because the anxiety was so high and I was so young and I didn't have the ability to like understand and wrap my head around it. So deep breathing was just like, it just would induce more panic sometimes. And now, breathing exercises at this point in my life are very useful. But I think that's something good for people to hear too, that just because something didn't work at one point in the process and what you were learning doesn't mean that it won't work at another point. Like when you start to scaffold and you build this toolkit that you have access to,
Mhm.
revisit things that other people have found useful, or are other skills that are out there. And I think you've said a couple of really cool things that I want listeners to be able to latch onto, that emotions are not who you are. They're part of the
Yeah.
experience. They're something that happened to us, but they're not who we are. And we can allow that separation, that degree of separation from that, because I think a lot of times that's where we start, like, guilt plays in, or shame plays in, or feeling really hopeless and disappointed in ourselves because of an emotion happening, right? Like, and it's so unfair to ourselves to say that, because we don't have control over the emotion happening, and being able to do what you said with that. And then you also said, like, you don't necessarily ever master
No.
this experience, being able to have a handle on it. It's not about mastering it. And I think this normalizes people being able to recognize, like, we're we are mental health professionals, like, and we're still saying it's not mastered by any means. It's not something to be mastered, and
Mm-mm.
allowing that to just be a truth that we can reconcile for ourselves, to say, like, this isn't something to be mastered, to be solved, to be cured. It's just something that we have to navigate when it pops up, and we have lots of different ways to know how to do that. And I think that helps separate out another feeling of like failure. I've failed to master it. But like, you don't do that. We don't do that.
No. And that's kind of where the humility and grace comes into play too. You
Yeah.
know, this
Mm-hmm.
black and white thinking is bad. That is the massive trap here. And that, why am I not fixed right now? Why
Yeah.
why haven't I gotten over this? Why can't I just beat this thing? Nah, you just practice it, let yourself off the hook a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
you'll actually go farther. You'll get closer to where you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe another thing to talk about is I practiced being bitter and angry, and I got energy off of that, and even drive. So maybe on one level, I was addicted to negative thinking and negative feelings.
Sure.
Because I got something out of it. It provided a structure for my life. It provided an energy, a drive. And anything you practice, you get good at. So you can, in my opinion, you can practice being aggressive and being angry and be addicted to anger. You could practice and get addicted to depression and sadness and to being a victim. And if you've lived long enough in that zone that you've kind of wired your brain to think that way, it's going to be a bit of a bitch to get out of it. And it's going to take strategy and practice to get out of it, but in thoughtful, intentional. I'm not going to live the rest of my life this way. Shit. I'm not going to go through my life with shit falling on my head and being a victim. I'm going to fucking stop this, and psyching yourself up, projecting yourself into a different psychological state and working on that, as well as working on the self-care and all the good stuff, so that you're not a professional self-loather, which I think I was.
And you have to have the insight to get there too, right? Because you can live like that.
Yeah.
And when you're not even aware of it, you don't even notice it. It's just the status quo. You can't step out of it. You can't step out of something that you don't know isn't happening. And it becomes what you're saying. And I've been there too. Part of your personality. We envelop these, what are just actual emotional experiences, and we let them become a personal trait. I was for a long time a very angry person, and I walked around feeling mad at the world and ready to lash out at any moment. And it was always this, we do this a lot for ourselves. And I think we all know a lot of other people who do this too, but we say, that's just how I am. Right. That doesn't have to be just how you are. There's this ability to recognize, one, have the insight and awareness to this is how you present, and two, know that this doesn't have to be part of your identity. These things are not identity characteristics in and of themselves. We just absorb them in such a way that we ingrain them that way, but we can separate that out. But there's a loss there, right? Let's acknowledge that part of it too. Yeah. There's a loss, because these parts of our personality, for me it was anger, for you it was self-loathing, but they do something for us. There's some kind of protective factor. They're this thing aiding us in some way, and to let that drop down, what am I without it? Who am I without it? Do I get shit done the same way without it? Am I propelled forward if I'm not beating myself up about things at every turn? That's scary. And it's scary. It's anxiety inducing. And it is, it's a barrier for that, because we do have to go through a loss.
It is an existential dread. The loss of self.
It is
the loss of identity.
Dread. Yeah. Who am I without this?
Around. Yeah. Yeah. And when I was trying desperately to change my life, when I was hitting bottom and skidding along and going in and out of jail and crashing cars and blacking out and getting in fistfights in the street in my late 30s and in bars and all that, just bam, just hitting my face against it again and again and again, and not able to think of any way out, not able to get out. I realized that if I just quit my job and left and had a big adventure and gave away my career and focused solely on fixing my life and getting my health back, I could probably do it. Or at least that's what I needed to do,
Yeah.
But it took me years to get the gumption to do that, because I was making good money. But a lot of it was the unknown. A lot of it was what am I going to be if I do that? This is all I know. I'm the bar guy. I'm the good time guy. But it wasn't. I was not happy at all. I was bitter and
Mm-hmm.
angry and all that. And it took a lot of time to build up the willpower and the courage to take that leap of faith. And once I did, it like I broke through into an entirely like different perceptive space or viewpoint of the world where I was like,
Yeah.
I'm still fucked right now, but there's more stuff out here. And I just cut my lifeline. So I better get going. And, but there was motion. I had movement in my life and possibility, good and bad. And so I had breaking free of the rigidity of thought. I wasn't anywhere. That was step one, I guess. I wasn't anywhere
Mm-hmm.
close to where I wanted to be, and I was still in a lot of danger. I was still drinking like crazy,
Mm-hmm.
but I had the first steps towards traction, and
What was the
that's
pivotal
huge.
point for you? Because you're talking like it sounds like there was insight on and off for a while, but what was the pivotal point where it turned insight into action, where you were like, I'm doing something about it, quitting this job, first step, I gotta do something.
I was thinking about it for years.
Mm-hmm.
That I needed to leave the job because the job was clearly a part of my problem. The massive hours, the high stress, the no life, not able to have a relationship, like that. It was propelling my alcoholism. Um, but to get rid of that would mean like losing all my money, and I was blowing through all my money anyway. So I wasn't like saving up much. Uh, so I thought about it for years, and I had many events that could be considered rock bottom events,
Mm-hmm.
and none of them clicked. But I kept stewing on it. And to be honest with you, if I remember it correctly, I had some kind of epiphany in my sleep on, I believe it was October 20th, 2015.
I love that you have
Uh,
the date. Like that's like it was monumental enough that you know the date that it happened.
it was either the 20th or the 22nd.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I had made the decision in my sleep, and I woke up the next day. I'm like, well, fuck, I'm doing it. And that was probably a big thing for me because I was no longer stewing about doing it. I was just like,
Yeah.
my die was cast, and I just had to put some things in place financially and career wise, and phone calls and train to go on the hike the Pacific Crest Trail,
Mm-hmm.
and I just started doing them. I don't know. It's kind of par for the course for me that it actually happened while not being conscious. Uh,
Well,
After all
it's
I just said
perfect.
earlier.
No, it's perfect because it's exactly what we were talking about in the last episode. How important sleep is because we do some of our biggest emotional processing and problem solving in REM,
Mm.
in our REM cycle, and that's like your conscious brain wasn't capable of doing that fully. Like it was wavering and going back and forth, and like this can't keep going, and not doing anything about it. So your unconscious brain stepped in and did something for you. I think that's like a really good example of stripping it back to the basics and why that matters, right?
I guess so. Yeah.
How long were you in that cycle of doing what you were doing, the drinking and the spending the money and the working yourself to the bone at this job and like knowing that this wasn't something that you could keep doing forever, it wasn't healthy, it wasn't good for you? How long were you in that cycle?
I would say I was in it in some sense from the day I started that career. So it would be 9 years, but I would say 6 years. It was bad. Like the wheels started to come off my life, um, where I was shutting down. I was no longer interacting with my family, even though they only lived 45 minutes away. I was no longer
Mm-hmm.
interacting nearly as much with my friends.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was paying less attention to how I presented, my attire, my self care, those kinds of things. My taking care of my body. And then the last 3 years, I was just an absolute mess. Everything was falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
So I was put on a lot of weight. That's where like I said, I started going in and out of jail, and I had 3 car crashes, fist fights, all this stuff. And I was starting to really fuck up my career. And so my reputation was being
Mm.
destroyed.
Yeah.
And I felt so physically ill and all these things that I could see the future that I was heading towards.
Mm-hmm.
And it was going to be some kind of cataclysmic event that I wasn't going to be able to walk away from,
Mm-hmm.
whether have a heart attack, um, die in a DUI, and do a serious amount of jail, or God forbid, hurt somebody really, really bad.
Yeah.
Violence or drunk driving, like a
Yeah.
a very irresponsible person. And um, I couldn't. There was nothing else to think about. I
Mm-hmm.
thought about it all the time, and I'm like drinking and thinking about it. I'm at the bar thinking about it, like while I'm doing the thing that's killing me,
Mm-hmm.
that's causing the problem. I'm thinking about it. So yeah, 6 years was really bad, and then 3 years where it was an absolute nightmare. And at any moment during that time, I was, like to say, I was just so fucking irresponsible.
Mm-hmm.
Was a bad person at that time. And I've always tried, I think, to be a decent person. And I just there was no excuse for my behavior at that time. And I think that I was just done. I was so done with myself that I I had to do something. And I just hit my head against the wall for so long, you know,
Mm-hmm.
until change occurred. Till I
Sounds
woke
like
up.
almost in that, like, your true identity got away from you as this other stuff was becoming more and more present and more prevalent. And what we were talking about with taking on traits and emotions as identity components, and you took these in and they became the new identity at the expense of the identity of, like, who you were, saying you were a good person, you cared about people, and that stuff went to the wayside. You got so caught up in just that version of you and those things that were happening. And, like, yeah. And I wanted you to speak to how long it was going on. I think it's important for other people to be able to hear that you can be in something for years, 3 years at its worst, right? At its
Mm.
peak, 3 years is so long. And then 9 years total, you said, like, it started when you started
Mm.
that job, like, but still almost a decade in this state where it was getting increasingly more significant and dangerous for you, and you could still come out of that. Like, I think that's really helpful for people to hear, people who have been there and who know that and have had that experience. And there, it doesn't even sound like there's this immediate light bulb moment where something, like you said, hit rock bottom, then you come right back up, you're like, that was rock bottom, and this is my comeback, baby, right? Like, it wasn't that. It was a lot of
Mm.
contemplation, and there was some epiphanies along the way, but, like, it wasn't. I think a lot of times people do get caught up in looking for or waiting for that pivotal moment, and maybe there's not always one.
No, there isn't, or there wasn't for me. There wasn't like that moment where, you're going in one direction, then you're going in the other.
Yep.
Uh, that didn't happen. And, I said 9 years and all that. I had already been drinking irresponsibly, addictively for 10 years before that. It was
Mm-hmm.
just, that's when I was on the downward slope where it was no longer fun anymore on any
Yeah.
level. I had lost the joy or whatever, the
Whatever
pleasure
you were getting
out of
out
it.
of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was all
Mm-hmm.
negative. And it was all that, this has all been for me, was a coping mechanism for depression and
Mm-hmm.
ADHD, childhood trauma. But this is existence. This is the story of my life. And when I made this like my profession, like before I started earning money, but like figuring this shit out is what I'm going to do, you know, before making money. I took a vow of poverty. I'm like, I don't care. I'm going to figure this out if I have to be dirt poor for the rest of my life because it's better than living this way.
Yeah.
And focusing solely on that. That's when, you know, taking big swings and trying crazy things and like reading and doing my own research and learning and trying everything and making this my life has been how I learned all of this, and it has been so valuable. I spent the first half of my life running away from my life, and the second half I'm spending facing it and figuring it out and continuing to turn into life instead of like checking out and, you know, like, yeah, let's fucking do this.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's the big overarching lesson. And then all of everything else is like the tools that you put in place to create, like you said, the scaffolding that gives you a balanced, structured, intentional life that allows you to execute your values and to face your fears as best you can and to move forward.
Yeah, I love it. The moral of that story is, you know, we can run and run and run, but it's still catching up to us. So don't be afraid to lean in, and let's learn how to lean in because it's scary to lean in. And we've all been there in different ways. We've all been there, and it's part of the human experience. And it's where again I go back to that integrity versus despair at the end of life. But that's where when we're looking back at whatever age we're on our deathbed, if we're lucky enough to have one, I guess. But you know, this is part of that. This is thinking about that, and like you said, you're facing it now, and it was hard, and it took time, and it took effort, and it took grieving to get here.
Yeah. And it's actually, you know, it's better now. You know, like I still think about this stuff. I still deal with this stuff. I have so many tools in place. I'm in such better health that I've created enough space in my life for enjoyment, for healthy living. You know, I didn't get the girl until I got sober. You know, I was for the last 10 years of my alcoholism, I knew I couldn't be a partner because I was so fucked up.
Yeah.
You know, I picked the bottle instead. And Alex has said, you know, like, well, at least he did that, you know, that was a choice. That was a good choice. But so if you were to think in your life that you've blown it or that it's too late, and somebody says, you know, it's never too late, you're like, that's a cliche, you know, it's not true. No, it's totally true. It's so fucking worth it. I didn't get the girl till I was over 40 years old.
Yeah.
And it's awesome. It's so
worth it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and it's just a weird place to potentially leave it, but sometimes I think about this. If I hadn't lived the life I did and been fucked up the way I was, I wouldn't know what I know, and I wouldn't have the partner. I would not have met her. And I can't, no.
And truly, if you hadn't done all of that work, you wouldn't be the version of yourself that your partner would want to be with, I bet.
Probably. Yep. We've said that. We've both said that. And now I do this and I have a career that I believe in. And I work with people that I connect with over this huge existential challenge. And I'm like, I see you.
I think this is a big part of, I think this is a big part of, for people like us, how we get into this line of work of helping people, of coaching and clinical coaching and support in that capacity, is like, we want to support people in their own progress and their growth and who they want to be. And because we believe in change, because we've had to change, because we've seen these versions of ourselves that were not the best version of ourselves, the version of ourselves that we wanted to be, that were healthy, that made us feel good. And we put in effort over a long time to change that. And we know that people are capable of it. And if they want it, we want to make sure that they can get it. And we want to be whatever that support system for them in getting there.
Yeah. I get greedy over this shit. There's so much validation and meaning out of helping other people travel the same arc that you have. It's incredibly validating for existence. And seeing these other people win and change is incredible.
I say all the time to the people that I'm working with, like, I'll hold the hope for you, even if you feel really hopeless and pessimistic about your ability to change and to be doing what you want to be doing and being who you want to be in the world. I'll hold that hope for you because I've been there. I've been in your shoes where I didn't feel like I could achieve that either for myself. And I know that it's possible. And because we've been through it, we know that it's possible. And it makes it easier for us to hold that hope for people when they can't.
Yeah. That's a good line. I'm going to steal that.
Yeah. You're welcome to it.
I think it's probably a good place to end, but I think that's really powerful, that holding hope for one another.
Sorry for our abrupt ending, everyone. In these first few episodes, we were still honing in our outro, thanks to feedback from our previewing audience. So in the future, hopefully you won't feel like these end like The Sopranos did. But for now, we just want to say thank you for joining us on Death and All the Rest and exploring all things existential with us. We look forward to future episodes that you can join us for.